Las Vegas. A city of lights, luck, and legends. But beneath the neon glow and the endless chime of slot machines lies an empire that wasn't crafted by architects or statesmen, but by gangsters, grifters, and shadowy partners in tailored suits. For the mob, Vegas was a gold mine, a place where millions in dirty money could be laundered clean. It was the city where Bugsy Siegel dreamed big, only to end up with his brains on a Beverly Hills wall. Where Tony the Ant Spilottro's reign of terror still echoes, with bodies from his era still washing up in barrels at Lake Mead today.
5:34 now. This morning we are following developing news out of Lake Mead. The National Park Service is saying human remains were discovered at Boulder Beach just yesterday afternoon.
Now, this marks the third time in just 2 months that remains have been found at the lake.
But the scam didn't start with Tony the Ant or the Mafia at all. 100 years before the mob arrived, traders and gunslingers had already set the tone. Corrupt enough to turn the desert into fertile ground for organised crime, a culture that made the Mafia takeover possible. Call it ambition or call it corruption, but the oasis in the middle of the desert was built on everything that fascinates us about the mobsters, the bookies, the bets, and the convoluted world of organised crime. Here's the story of how the mob built Vegas and how Vegas built the mob. The Mojave Desert has been inhabited for thousands of years, first by the Puebloans and then by the Nuwuvi people. The Nuwuvi lineages gave rise to the later Paiute tribe, which is much more recent and well known, but that's an interesting ancestral tale for another day. Las Vegas, as a recorded town at least, has been around since the 1800s, and its modern roots had nothing to do with mobsters, but it was constructed on the same principles that made the Mafia so unimaginably powerful there. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the lawless ways of the old Wild West and the New Age gangs would eventually bleed into one singular mecca for gambling, prostitution, and all things that catered to man's vices. It is a magical place on the surface, an outward mask of wealth, luxury and luck, exactly as it was planned to be. So let us begin at the start, all the way back in 1829. This was when a Mexican explorer by the name of Rafael Rivera worked as a scout for a successful Spanish trading company. They were looking for a better route between New Mexico and Los Angeles. Rivera accidentally stumbled upon this literal oasis in the Mojave Desert, where the native groups had already been frequenting for thousands of years. The wild grasses grew high, there was greenery, and even a few trees, a stark contrast to the barren landscape around it. The multitude of natural underground springs that came together here would later become a crucial stop on the old Spanish Trail for the next 70 years. Rivera named the place Las Vegas, which translates to the meadows in Spanish. Predictably, an informal town sprung up around the richest source of water for miles, and they kept the name that Rivera had bestowed upon that little pocket of paradise in the middle of the vast yellow expanses. There was a group of Mormons that tried to settle in the area in the 1850s, but they didn't last long. The native tribes were already being pushed out by the traders, cutting off their access to the springs. Understandably, they weren't too enthusiastic about trading and sharing what little water-rich land they had left with more Europeans, especially not white men who were insistent on converting them to the new Mormon movement. In 1865, prospector Octavius Decatur Gass came along and took possession of the fort that the Mormons had left behind. He did a little bit of cattle rearing and he made some wine on the side that he supplied to the surrounding miners. Though his operations weren't exactly a large enterprise, Gass was technically the first person to offer any kind of hospitality in Vegas. He called his ranch Las Vegas de Rancho, keeping the title bestowed on the place by Rivera intact. Sadly, Gas couldn't keep up with the harsh agricultural conditions of the desert. He accumulated a lot of debt to cover his crop and cattle losses over the years, forcing him to sell his ranch.
It wasn't until 1905 that Las Vegas even had its first official census and was logged in the US registry as a town in its own right. There were only 800 permanent residents in that first census, and they were already an eclectic bunch. What else would you expect from a town that had gone without any formal oversight for nearly a century and was the main stop for every trader, merchant and a fair number of dangerous bandits, most of them on the run from the law? The US was full of seedy, informal towns just like this one back then. The residents of Las Vegas were in absolutely no rush to get their name on any official state logbook anyway. Lawmakers and enforcers just made it harder to conduct business, and quite frankly, they could do without more government oversight to complicate their way of life.
And here's where people get a lot of Vegas's beginnings wrong. They start the history in 1931 when gambling was legalized, but they skip out on the 30 years that preceded the law change. And what a shame, because the entire stage for the mob takeover was set between 1905 and 1930. The culture and spirit that Vegas was built on is a great part on why it was so ripe for the taking. The whole reason that Las Vegas was given the title of a town was so that land could be sold legally to make way for a railway line. In the end, the Union Pacific Railroad, a subsidiary of the Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad, won the auction and bought 1,800 acres of land. That 20-block town site became the Union Pacific Road in just a few years after the purchase. This railway industrialized the Spanish route. The Mojave Desert was full of little mining towns, most of them focused on silver and gold. And all of that product needed to be transported to the rest of the country, not to mention everyone mining around the springbed needed access to that water. In the next 5 years, the population more than doubled. And what do you get when you've got a bunch of seasonal workers coming and going? You have a lot of working age men who want to unwind between work weeks with booze, sex, and cards. So Vegas was already the kind of environment that turned a blind eye to activities that would have made the rest of the conservative US clutch at their pearls. To accommodate this, in 1906 the Golden Gate Hotel opened on Fremont Street, or as you might know it, the Las Vegas Hotel, probably the most notable historic building in the city to this day. Besides being the first official hotel made out of concrete and bricks in the fledgling city, it was also the hub for gambling since the first day that its doors opened. It was the crowning jewel of Fremont Street then, as it is now, and this is what I mean when I refer to the spirit of the town. Vegas had a lawless aura about it since the beginning. Only now was there a touch of class too, thanks to the mining tycoons and investors that were coming in. These new visitors came from old money, and contrary to outward appearances, old money really likes pretty girls and betting copious amounts of money for show. People just sort of looked the other way when the bigwigs indulged a little, because with them came good business. So even if gambling was technically illegal, no one was going to report any of it. But the completion of the Tonopah Railroad and the newly erected Lincoln Hotel, located on South Main Street, was what really steamrolled the city into the only stop worth making in the Mojave Desert. The Lincoln was later renamed to the Victory Hotel, and the outrageous parties held here were what cemented Vegas as the railroad boomtown for the next 20 years. Vegas became known for being the place where you could have a good time without needing to constantly look over your shoulder.
Despite being the stop for everyone and their rich uncles within the mining and trading spheres, Vegas had very few permanent residents. The thousands of people that were coming through were always there temporarily. Vegas had perfected the art of attracting tourism long before the mob had ever even heard of it. It took until 1930 for it to get a permanent population that surpassed just 5,000, but that figure would be transformed overnight by the arrival of the Hoover Dam.
A presidential motorcade arrived at Boulder Dam, where 20,000 waited the dedication of the mammoth power and irrigation project. Then it was the mightiest construction job in all history, the greatest dam of the world.
And now's where we get to the point where most people begin. The true boom, 1931, when construction on the Hoover Dam began and gambling was officially made legal in Nevada. The change happened quietly at first, with only the residents and usual business tycoons really enjoying the change and steady growth of the town in those first few years. But the incredibly unstable state of affairs between the major crime syndicates in the rest of the US would soon force the syndicates to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The state of Nevada, thanks to the very same Wild West roots that built Vegas, was the only state in the entire country that was willing to make gambling legal. The rest were at the tail end of Prohibition and much too occupied with the Great Depression, or they were still recovering from the First World War, to care much about what was happening in the old desert towns. The Mafia families and Irish and Jewish syndicates that ran the show in the rest of the country had set their operations in place in the midst of Prohibition when alcohol was illegal. They ran massive bootlegging operations that controlled entire shipyards, carved secret tunnels through New York's underground railways to move liquor, and seized transportation companies to keep their product flowing coast to coast. Yet even at the height of this success, the Mafia was tearing itself apart. The Italian factions were locked in some of the bloodiest internal wars in their history, more focused on survival and wiping out rivals than enjoying their spoils. So, for now, their attention wasn't on Vegas. The construction of the Hoover Dam doubled the city's inhabitants. Every 2 weeks, the boys working on the dam got their paychecks, and that's when Vegas went into overdrive. Every fortnight, it was a 3-day binge of craps, poker, and the first mechanized slot machines ran constantly. Back then, the only person of interest operating in the shadows was Jim Ferguson, a nobody from Memphis, Tennessee, who moved to Vegas in the early 1920s. The king of the Tenderloin, as he was more commonly referred to, was a freelance criminal not associated with any major crime faction or gang at all. He just had the nerve to overthrow any budding criminal enterprises before they got a good foothold, and he roughed up enough girls to make a minor fortune off his brothels. The brothels gave him enough financial might to bribe the right people to stay out of jail. Or he'd use his generous wallet to get dirt on public figures to keep them at arm's length. The workmen's salaries paved the way for more hotels, more casinos, and a greater need for women on call. Ferguson banked off all of Vegas for a good decade without any significant interference.
However, his reign was short-lived. He didn't go down in a blaze of gunfire like the other greats in this line of work did though. When bigger fish started eyeing the growing city and all of its lucrative delights, he knew well enough to take his earnings and quietly disappear into the background. The guys who were about to step into the fold were too much to handle for this small town Tennessee boy, and to be quite honest, he didn't quite like the idea of painting Fremont Street red with his own blood over a turf war. There were a few characters with mob ties, but no one quite powerful enough to take over the town. Just a few dangerous figures who, well, didn't mind getting their hands dirty.
But Ferguson's habit of getting politicians and people of importance in his pocket further cemented Vegas as the place to get corrupt management in your corner. In the Wild West, if the price was right, then anyone was for sale. By the time Fremont Street was laid out officially, becoming the first cobbled street in the town and the centre for the rowdiest, loudest and most outrageous parties, the bigwigs that oversaw Hoover Dam were fuming. They'd planned for Boulder City to be the hub for miners to spend their money, and they'd thrown a great deal of resources into temporary housing, hotels, and all sorts of entertainments. Boulder being alcohol-free, gambling-free, and morally regulated, they threw all of their weight into planning wholesome, fancy events, hoping to attract contractors, mining magnates, and everyone in between. Their plan was to host derbies and barbecues, with high society ladies walking round in big hats and puffy dresses, men with suits that had hidden pocket watches and long, manicured mustaches. But Boulder didn't stand a chance. Las Vegas, with all of the contractors, the miners, and a big chunk of Hoover's own upper management behind them, retaliated in the best way possible. They threw one hell of a party in 1935. The Eldorado Days event was a 4-day bash held on Fremont Street. The event was planned to go completely in the opposite direction of what Boulder had advertised. There were performances by dancing troupes, creatively named girly shows, floats and parades, circus-type acts, and there were stands where men could have their beards painted and shaved into outrageous patterns. It was wild, it was outlandish, and it was utterly shameless.
Eldorado was a smashing hit, much to Boulder's annoyance, and it's still a staple in Las Vegas today. This was the first inkling of how little the crowd cared for the upper class pretending that the rich partied different than the rest, when the only difference between Vegas and Boulder was that Las Vegas put their sins out on full display, whilst the rest hid them behind closed doors. And with their sins out on full display, Las Vegas attracted the kind of people who sinned, and sinned often.
The decisive vote of the 36th state against Prohibition is happy news for the grain raisers of the United States and for many others throughout the land. With an eye on December 5th, work is being rushed in distilleries and bottling works. Thousands are being called back to work in plants of allied industries. At least 500,000 new jobs are predicted as the result of repeal.
In 1933, Prohibition ended, and this threw everything out of control. The majority of the Mafia's earnings came from illegal gambling and whiskey imported from Scotland and Canada, but now that alcohol was legal again, those industries fell flat like a house of cards. First went the booze sales, and with it went the transportation lines that were so carefully crafted. And when the money runs out, desperate dogs start turning on each other. The Sicilian grip on the underworld began to unravel as the bloody shootouts and assassinations of the Castellamarese War became as common in the headlines as updates on Humphrey Bogart.
The US had completely lost control of all of their major cities in the midst of Prohibition. The mob didn't just own the cities, they had the majority of the mayors, senators, and judges on their personal payrolls. The important lawmakers was so deep in the underworld's pockets that getting the players in court by the proper channels was virtually impossible. And just when they thought that the mobsters were going to completely wipe each other out in their increasingly violent wars, saving the authorities the trouble of locking them up, Lucky Luciano strolls in and forms the Commission.
The Commission formalised the 5 major families of New York, creating a singular powerhouse of crime. Lucky also got Florida, Chicago, Cleveland and all of the rest of the big cities on board. If they weren't willing to put their past grievances aside for the greater good of the Mafia, then the majority of the factions would force them out of business. He even diversified his operations by bringing in the Jews and the Irish. This level of organisation between the three major crime factions was unprecedented, and the authorities had no idea how to stop it from happening. The previous mob hubs for gambling were in Los Angeles, Reno, and New York City, and for a second it looked like the Mafia wars were going to crumble all of those empires. But as we now know, Lucky's restructuring saved those streams of income just in time. So the authorities decided that the best place to start gaining some ground would be to attack illegal gambling operations. Logically, it was the only move that they could make. Besides, almost every other illegal venture run by the mob was tied to the gambling joints in some way or another. Prostitution, drugs, racketeering, weapons. The gambling front had taken the place of the now defunct bootlegging business. With this pressure coming from the law, focused solely on their main hub for business, the mob was forced to turn their attention to the only place where gambling was legal, Las Vegas. Right in the heart of the place where the overall attitude of accepting morally corrupt behaviour and business deals was part of the culture already. The first trickle of mobsters that came in were small-time crooks, or guys who'd angered enough of the bigger fish to warrant the need to find a place to lay low for a while. Nothing major, just enough sleazy characters to keep the underground scene and corruption going strong.
As we get into the move over to Vegas, I'll be mainly skimming over the main players that are about to step into the fold and where they fit in. This is about Vegas's rise thanks to the mob, so the coverage of the specific mobsters and women that made it happen will be merely an overview. Saying that though, there was one guy, one figure amongst them who stood out above the rest, a man whose name would become inseparable from the story of Las Vegas, and his name was Bugsy Siegel.
The most important player in building Vegas is undoubtedly Benjamin Siegel, or as you might better know him, Bugsy Siegel. He was named Bugsy on the streets because of his volatile and unpredictable nature. You know the saying crazy as a bedbug? He'd been called that so often that it just got shortened to Bugsy after a while. He had risen from teenage street thug to crime boss alongside his childhood friends Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. With Lansky, he ran the Bugs and Meyer mob, focusing on transportation and protection of beer trucks during Prohibition. It's under this gang that they created Murder Inc., the infamous Jewish-run contract-killing operation. Their hitmen took out huge names like Dutch Schultz, who practically ruled the Bronx, and both sides of the Castellamarese War, Joe the Boss Mazzaria and Salvatore Maranzano, paving the way for Lucky Luciano to restore the peace in New York. In fact, Bugsy was also one of the first men that Luciano brought into the newly formed commission. The Sicilians would never have mingled with a Jew before, but Bugsy and Lucky's friendship went back to childhood, and Bugsy had the willpower, the nerve, and the wealth to win over even the most skeptical Italians. Lucky once said that Siegel was pound for pound the toughest man he'd ever met, and that kind of praise for a Jew was unprecedented. The Sicilians took notice. To have Bugsy as an ally was invaluable, but to have him as an enemy, well, that was a gamble that no one was willing to take. But Bugsy had two sides to him. On the one hand, he was the dashing, well-dressed mobster with a quick fuse and a stone-cold trigger finger. Exactly the kind of character that the old mob paperbacks liked to depict. But on the other side, he had a private life with a wife and kids that he managed to juggle for years. But Bugsy's taste for Hollywood actresses and his numerous dalliances with the girls from his many, many brothels eventually led to the end of his marriage. In the life of mobsters and swindlers, a steady family life was never part of the deal. After they had conquered New York, Bugsy moved to Los Angeles on Lucky and Lansky's command, which had become the best place to set up shop for underground dealings after the crackdown on gambling began. And through the connections of the commission, Bugsy was introduced to Mickey Cohen. Born Meyer Harris Cohen, he was a professional boxer before delving into organised crime, mainly through the Chicago faction. He worked his way into the Los Angeles scene with brute force when it came to other mobsters. But when it came to the Hollywood crowd, his flair for flamboyance and his flashy style won him a seat next to the biggest names of the day, Frank Sinatra being one of them. It's this connection through Mickey that got Bugsy in touch with the right people when he'd later move over to Vegas. Together, Mickey and Bugsy ran gambling rackets, extortion schemes, and controlled bookmaking operations. Mickey would later continue these criminal hustles when Bugsy left for Nevada, while playing a major part in setting up gigs, performances, and movie premieres over in the desert in a few years' time. Other figures had their part to play too, but none had the permanent seat in Hollywood quite like Mickey did. For all that Bugsy and Mickey had their fingers in all the lucrative pies, the authorities were always several steps behind. Bugsy, working alongside Lucky and Frank Costello, went on to set up the drug shipment networks between Mexico and the US that paved the roads for the big drug lords decades after his death. Bugsy, with his sharp suit and roguish good looks, rubbed shoulders with Frank Sinatra, Clark Gable, and Jean Harlow. His drug operations and shameless extortion of famous actors, directors, and producers during the 30s and early 40s is what gave him the financial leg up to tackle Las Vegas. Hollywood publisher and nightclub owner Billy Wilkerson contacted Bugsy in the mid-40s. Wilkerson had been in the process of building a new hotel, the Flamingo, in Vegas, but due to war shortages and his own enormous debts, Wilkerson had run out of money. Luckily, Wilkerson knew a guy who just so happened to run Hollywood with an iron fist, a whole lot of money coming in from exactly the kind of business that Vegas was being built on, and the man of Hollywood himself, Bugsy Siegel. This happened to coincide with the commission's plan to send Bugsy to Vegas to take over the horse racing scene over there. Betting on the ponies was legal in Nevada, but getting horses on the tracks was not what the Mafia was interested in. Bugsy controlled the wires, the communication between radio and track, that broadcast the results to the rest of the country. Bugsy got the results first, tipped off the bookies, and between the bookies and Bugsy, they could sway bets before the results came out on the wires to the public. So he loaded up his shiny car alongside his longtime right-hand man Mo Sedway, and together they drove into town. The road was so narrow that two cars couldn't pass by each other safely, but Bugsy saw past the dust and the workmen's dirty overhauls. Bugsy saw an opportunity with the half-finished Flamingo Hotel.
He looked at the El Rancho and the Las Vegas Hotel with their very wealthy clientele. He saw the high street and all of its sawdust bars, the women for hire prospecting clients out in the open, and he noticed the constant ring of the slot machines. It all just came together for him. Bugsy saw how debauchery, human vices, and all of the delights of the nightlife could come together with the glitz and the glamour of Hollywood, only he saw it bigger, grander, and so lavish that it bordered on flashy. In other words, Bugsy Siegel saw the future. But Bugsy was going to be smart about it. While he took over the wire service and by extension the entire horse racing scene by force, his lack of contact and failure to report business back tested the patience of both New York and Chicago. So Bugsy left that part over to Mo. Mo was the quiet enforcer, the man of few words. He was the seller of Bugsy's ideas, whilst Bugsy spent lavishly posed for the press, and flaunted his power and his hot temper every chance he got.
In 1946, Bugsy was putting all of his resources into finishing the Flamingo on the Las Vegas Strip. He wasn't just building a casino, he was building a palace, carpeted throughout, fountains, buffets and waiting staff. He was putting in paved fronts and luxurious rooms. The Flamingo was going to be the most extravagant establishment in Vegas, and it was going to be the centre for future joints that hosted dancing shows and dining places fit for royalty. He knew that if he could get the centrepiece set, then the rest would follow. But even with his lucrative wire hustle raking in the cash, it wasn't enough to cover the costs of this enormous 50,000 square foot paradise palace. It also didn't help that Bugsy constantly changed the blueprints. He'd have a pool put in, change his mind, bulldoze the entire thing and then have it installed on the other side of the property. Then he'd have whole lines of rooms torn down because he wanted the suites bigger, or maybe he didn't like the woodwork enough and the contractors had to start all over again. Initially, he'd planned on spending $1.5 million, that's about $23 million in today's money. But by the time he demanded all the changes, Bugsy had spent $6 million, that's upwards of $93 million today. And this was almost all out of Bugsy's pocket and loans from Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. Lansky and Costello were still trying their hardest to get the commission on board with the Flamingo, but they were hesitant to invest too heavily into a maybe. All in all, when Wilkinson's expenditures were added to Bugsy's budget, the Flamingo cost approximately $120 million in today's money to build when it finally opened on Boxing Day of 1946, and it was a total disaster. That day it rained cats and dogs in California, grounding all of the planes that were bringing in headliners like Jimmy Durante and Xavier Cugat. He'd paid for George Raft, George Sanders, Eleanor Parker, Charles Coburn, Vivian Blaine, Sonny Tufts and George Jessel to attend, but they were stranded in California too. Since most of the rooms were not yet finished, the few people who did arrive left the sparse venue as soon as they won at the tables and didn't return for the rest of the 3-day event.
The fact that the opening was broadcast on the radio did actually bring in a great deal of the locals and the miners, which could have saved the Flamingo from losing a whopping $5 million in its opening weekend. Unfortunately though, Bugsy's staff showed the plain-dressed miners away. This was a strictly black-tie establishment, no jeans and hats allowed. The Flamingo closed its doors less than a month after it opened, but the oasis grounds, the carpeted floors and the extravagant finishings had impressed enough people to get Bugsy's vision some credence. This level of opulence wasn't just a pipe dream, Bugsy had managed to build an architectural masterpiece. Or at least most of it. All the Flamingo needed now was a few more names and a few more backers. And needless to say, the potential investors' interest was sufficiently piqued.
Between his old connections, Costello's smooth talking, and Meyer Lansky's good word to the commission back in New York, they got the right people on board in no time. Gus Greenbaum and Harry Rothberg were the first to buy in. They can be traced to the official books as silent partners. The Chicago outfit and the 5 reigning families in New York that made up the commission were all in on the bankroll too. Not that there's any record of them fronting Bugsy the money in any official books, but now Siegel definitely had enough power and money to steamroll the Flamingo into the stratosphere. Las Vegas was considered an open city, meaning no single family controlled it, allowing for this unique cross-family and multiracial investment to occur without turf wars. As long as everybody got their agreed upon cut from the earnings, then all would be well. Unfortunately though, this is Vegas, and these are career criminals. Neither are the best ingredients for any kind of honest business now, is it? This verbal agreement was doomed to go up in smoke eventually. Later, in 1947, when the Flamingo opened again, this time with all of its rooms, pools and lounges complete, it was a smashing hit. Celebrities, directors and publishers, encouraged by their good buddies Costello, Bugsy and Luciano, were arriving in droves to enjoy the oasis in the desert for their weekends off. On their tails came the mining magnates and the upper class of Boulder City that had so recently been the city's main competitors. Even the contractors working the mines in the surrounding area dusted off their best Sunday suits to get into this unimaginably decadent establishment. The thing that made the Flamingo so attractive was not just the extravagance, it was the fact that it rolled all of Vegas's entertainments into one singular complex. Dancing shows, casinos bigger than any other, dining halls, swimming pools, a place to sleep, lounges and stages to accommodate everything from singers to comedians to tap dancers and ventriloquists, vaudeville, cabaret, instrumental orchestras and numerous celebrity appearances. Take your pick. At the Flamingo, there was something going on to interest everyone. The place was garnering so many feet that the surrounding businesses upgraded their buildings to compete with this looming empire of glamour. The Flamingo was the very beginnings of the Strip, the main focal point of Las Vegas, just like Bugsy envisioned it to be. The books weren't exactly transparent, this is the mob we're talking about after all, but 1947 did turn a profit. That much we do know, but not nearly enough to cover the investors' interests. The real money lay in the casinos. Without security cameras and personnel to keep an eye over everything, and all of the transactions being made in physical bills, it shouldn't be surprising that everyone was skimming from the top. Bugsy spending aside, the waiters, the bar hands, the counting rooms, the floor managers, everywhere you looked someone was pocketing a few bills that belonged to the mob. The Flamingo was getting so much traffic that it should have been making more than enough to keep every partner very happy. But when it came down to counting the take at the end of the day, the Flamingo was barely scraping by, and the bosses weren't getting the cut that they were promised. Bugsy was spending outrageously. Fine dining, jewelry and tailored suits aside, he never stopped adding to the Flamingo. Even though the complex was technically completed, he never slowed down on its extensions, continuously adding to this obsessive dream to make his oasis the grandest, most magnificent place on the planet. He invested in plenty of bad business deals recklessly. He gambled on the horses, at the Flamingo's tables. If he could put money on something, Bugsy was willing to play the game. The mob itself was sure that Bugsy himself was skimming the most from the top. It was the news that his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, received $1 million in her Swiss bank account that sealed his fate.
So I think a little background on Virginia is in order here, and I almost hate to keep it short because Virginia is such an interesting character and she definitely deserves her own video. She started out as an Alabama native, moved to Chicago at the age of 16, became a prostitute at 17, and somehow she fell in with the Chicago outfit by the time she was 18. She became a courier of sorts, carrying messages between factions, known for her good looks, extraordinary charm, and unquestioning discretion. Virginia was more akin to a spy than just a messenger. Her presence in the wider underworld scene was accepted as she wasn't really officially tied to any one faction, and truth be told, she was respected by all, even by the bosses.
The FBI considered her one of the most dangerous figures during their war against the Mafia, not because Virginia had blood on her hands, it was because of the incredible power that comes with information. No one knew more secrets than the red-haired beauty whose words dripped honey and whose company was shared by everyone who was anyone in those days. She and Bugsy's relationship was considered a good match on the outside, but the bosses were nervous about her getting too close to one major player. Virginia was privy to a great deal of sensitive information, and they didn't like having all that extortion fodder in one man's bed. The final transfer to Virginia's account gave them all the proof that they needed. It might even have been Virginia herself that tipped them off about the generous gift from Siegel. Bugsy might have walked a long road with Costello, Luciano, Gus Greenbaum, Harry Rothberg, and even his best longtime friend Mo Sedway. But no amount of friendship in history can forgive stealing from the mob, especially when you owe them boatloads of money. Bugsy's new breath of success, the culmination of his dream, would end up lasting less than 4 months. At the end of June 1947, Bugsy and Virginia travelled to Los Angeles to Virginia's mansion for a few days. Virginia conveniently left for Paris to attend a fabulous party that had a few royals on the guest list. It was the first time in months that Bugsy had left Las Vegas. In LA, with so many feet and so many unsavoury characters running around, it was much easier to gain access to him without being seen.
Also, the various factions, outfits and smaller gangs of organised crime had long since agreed that Vegas was off limits to settle disputes in. If the numerous Italian, Jewish and Irish gangs were going to work together at all, then they needed to avoid the kind of bloodbath that the Castellamarese War had caused. What started as a power struggle for territory and ownership of bootlegging operations between New York's two ruling factions, Joe the Boss Mazzaria and Salvatore Maranzano, soon spiraled out of control, and its effects were felt outside of the Big Apple. By the end of the Castellamarese War, nearly every major faction in the country had some part to play in a conflict that was building up to kill everyone of importance in the underworld. If it wasn't for Lucky Luciano's brilliant tactical move to create the commission, they very well may have murdered each other completely in just a few more years. And the Mafia had learnt its lesson with that war. In Vegas, if there was a hit on anyone, for now, it had to be taken outside of the Mojave Desert. No exceptions.
On the night of June the 20th, 1947, Bugsy Siegel was seated on a sofa in the living room of 810 North Linden Drive, the Beverly Hills mansion he had leased for his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. He was reading a copy of the Los Angeles Times alongside his associate, Alan Smiley, an investor in the Flamingo. Suddenly, an assassin opened fire through the window, unleashing 9 shots in rapid succession. 4 found their mark, 2 striking Siegel in the chest and 2 in the head, 1 round tearing through his left eye. Many believe it was New York hitman Frankie Carbo of Murder Inc. who pulled the trigger, the very organisation that Siegel had helped to create, though, as with most mob hits, the true identity of the gunman remains uncertain. What is certain is that Siegel's death cleared the way. With Bugsy gone, his rivals assumed full control of the Flamingo. Given Virginia's reputation for being tight-lipped about essentials and the fact that she'd always been loyal to the mob first, makes it highly likely that she was tipped off about the hit in advance, allowing her to skip town in time. A few years later, in 1951, Virginia was forced to testify at the Takeover hearings, but she refused to give any names or even admit that she knew any mobsters at all.
Do you ever get any money from any other person whom we might call a gangster other than Siegel?
No.
Did you ever get any money from Costello?
No.
And did you ever get any money from Meyer Lansky?
I never got money from any of those fellas.
None of those
fellas.
Who knows how much she knew? Either way, the life eventually became too much for Virginia Hill, the self-proclaimed greatest gangster bride of all time. She took her own life in 1966 at the age of 49 near her residence in Korpel, Austria, having distanced herself from the mob. Exactly 3 minutes after neighbours reported hearing shots fired from the mansion in Los Angeles, 3 men walked into the Flamingo, announcing that everyone was to continue on with their jobs and that they were now their new employers. The men were Gus Greenbaum, Mo Sedway, and Nick Rosen. The confused employees accepted this without much fuss for several reasons. Firstly, the takeover was so swift that everyone was caught completely off guard. Secondly, Mo had been Bugsy's closest friend and virtually the boss anyway, so his place at the head of the establishment in Bugsy's absence wasn't just logical, it was expected. Thirdly, Greenbaum was an official partner, so he did fit into the overall picture. And finally, they all knew full well that their recently deceased boss was involved with the syndicates and the gangs, and they weren't foolish enough to contradict these men. But who was this Nick Rosen?
Details about Rosen's early life are scarce, but what we can gather from whistleblowers in the past was that he was a trusted associate of the New York mob, connected to Meyer Lansky. He had experience managing gambling operations and was considered a safe pair of hands when the Flamingo needed stabilising. One thing we do know is that Rosen managed to carve out a life in organised crime without rubbing anyone the wrong way. He had no obvious enemies, he had seemingly never double-crossed anyone during his tenure in the business, and he was greatly respected by the Jewish, Irish and Italian factions alike, and this is virtually impossible of someone who was so obviously a figure of great importance for so long.
These three stabilised the Flamingo, got the skimming down to a minimum, and split the necessary earnings to those who had stakes in the place. The Flamingo was thriving. While the feds were getting their own cards in order in the background, the strip was starting to take shape, just like Bugsy had envisioned for it to become. Resort-style complexes like the Silver Slipper, set up by 3 associates with documented mob connections, and the Desert Inn, owned by Mo Dalitz of the Cleveland mob. Even Benny Binion, the Texas gambler, was starting to dip his toes into the city. Benny wasn't a mob guy, he wasn't even mob adjacent. Benny was a gunslinger, a true Wild West man that operated by his own rules. Unlike Pretty Boy Floyd or Ma Barker's gang, Benny didn't make a living robbing trains or banks. He had the same business spirit that the Mafia did, especially when it came to betting. But he definitely had the quick trigger finger that the gunslingers were known to have. He was suspected of multiple murders of rival gamblers and bootleggers, and his own betting operations were being targeted by authorities that considered shutting him down, their personal project. And that's why he went to Vegas. Gambling was his speciality, so it made sense to go where it was legal. Benny was not embroiled in any scandals, hits, or even any fraud or skimming operations. For all that he was very obviously a criminal and a murderer, Benny actually ran a pretty honest ship. It's how he made his money that's important. His business model is as deeply ingrained in Vegas as the strip joints are. He purchased the El Dorado Club and the Apache Hotel before opening Binion's Horseshoe Casino on Fremont Street a few years later. He pioneered a high roller mindset by raising maximum table bets, offered generous comps, and insisted on transparent dealing. These player-focused innovations and outwardly honest tactics drew in professional gamblers that avoided mob-run businesses because they had a reputation to uphold. Benny set a new standard for casino hospitality. His larger-than-life personality, huge cowboy hat, and buckled boots were endearing and entertaining. In 1970, he founded the World Series of Poker, making the city the epicenter of competitive poker and boosting the city's international gaming prestige. Benny lived a long and fruitful life, dying at the age of 85 of natural causes. He had almost no enemies, and the only time he was ever seen with any mob men was at social or charity events where their interactions were always amicable. Meyer Lansky, on the other hand, had never lived in Vegas, preferring to keep his involvement on the down low, but he definitely owned a few places there, or at least held the title of silent partner in plenty of other establishments. Lansky's main role was as a financial engineer, and that's putting it lightly. Lansky did work for all of the factions, families and gangs, helping them launder money, move it to offshore accounts, and performed financial gymnastics that rewrote the way organised crime hid their earnings and paved the way for how it's done now. The man was a bona fide genius. He didn't get his hands dirty. Lansky made the books do the magic instead. If it weren't for him, none of the important players would have been able to finance any businesses in Vegas at all. By 1950, the glow of the many neon signs and the inordinate amount of lights cast a permanent glow over the city at night that could be seen from miles away. The population had grown to 25,000. That's a 125% growth from the last census. Not to mention the 7 to 8 million tourists that were coming in annually, a fair number of them being big shots from Hollywood. California was starting to lose bids on high attendance attractions against Vegas. This is around the time that the crowd-pulling Rat Pack was formed. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford and Joey Bishop had the feet coming in and the nights running late. Studios began partnering with Vegas casinos for promotional events, movie premieres, and celebrity appearances.
Whereas Los Angeles venues had curfews, union restrictions, and tighter licensing, the increasing restrictions and red tape that the mob had to sidestep forced them to put all of their financial backing and celebrity connections into Sin City. This was no longer even a race Vegas had already won, and it wasn't even a fraction of California's population yet. Vegas had left California in the dust, but it would soon find out that the real challenge wasn't the competition from the coast, but the gaze from the United States Senate.
The nation's underworld gets the unwelcome spotlight of publicity as the Senate's Investigations Subcommittee begins new hearings on crime.
In May of 1950, the government finally intervened. Unfortunately, their brilliant plan was executed much too prematurely. This was when Senator Estes Kefauver launched an official investigation into organised crime. This would eventually lead to the Kefauver hearings, where more than 600 witnesses, all with ties to organised crime, were hauled in to be questioned in front of the cameras. The likes of Jimmy Hoffa, Frank Costello, the infamously tight-lipped Virginia Hill, and Meyer Lansky all repeatedly pleaded the fifth, denied any involvement with crime bosses or even that they knew them at all, despite the plethora of photographic evidence that they did. There weren't any convictions or formal arrests that came out of this public spectacle, and the mobsters' refusal to talk and their backhanded quips made law enforcement and the governmental bigwigs look like a children's council.
Well, you're looking back over the years now to that time when you became a citizen, and we're now standing 20-odd years after that. You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they?
Paid my tax.
The Kefauver hearings wasn't a complete failure though. It did expose the national reach of the Mafia, showing that organised crime wasn't just a New York or Chicago problem, it was embedded in politics, law enforcement and businesses across the country. And it proved to the feds that their diplomatic way of approaching the problem was useless. They needed to fight fire with fire. The hearings and their monumental impact on the Mafia was a huge turning point for the Mafia and their ongoing war against the feds, the IRS, and the US government. The hearings were meant to intimidate the Mafia into hiding and to get them to finally talk, but it ended up doing exactly the opposite. The hearings did at least prove the reality of just how enormous the Mafia and gang problem was, and that it could no longer be denied. The feds now had the support of the public and the backing of every figurehead that wasn't paid for by the underworld. That meant that the federal jurisdiction could finally start making law changes in Nevada, the last foothold of the lawless Wild West. The new law in the United States was that anyone with ties to organised crime was prohibited from owning casinos. Casinos were required to disclose all investors and financial backers, and everyone with a gambling licence was forced to open their financial records to government oversight. These reforms forced the mob to go underground. They began using frontmen, legitimate businessmen, and corporate shells to maintain control.
These laws included not just the mob and the gangs, it also put anyone who had previous murder convictions, drug lords and criminals associated with fraud, theft and impersonation into the mix as well. The unintended side effect of all these criminals being put in the same pot made all of them flock to Vegas in droves. Every corner of the country was going through a federal powered eradication, so everyone affected by these crackdowns decided that they might as well be surrounded by others who were in the same boat, regardless of their affiliations, how mighty or lowly they were, or if they were even in the same industries or not. Trying to police Las Vegas with thousands of criminals running all over the place meant that the feds had their hands so full with petty criminals that the big fish disappeared into the midst of the chaos. The ones they were initially hunting down just used the distractions to put legit businessmen and everyday Joes on their payrolls to act as frontmen for their empires so that they could keep their casinos even if a nobody's name was on the deed.
A year after the Kefauver hearings, 4 new massive luxury hotels opened on the Strip to keep up with demand, and an unprecedented amount of apartment buildings, cheap motels and hostels for aspiring entertainers. And at the head of every one of them was a man in a black suit, keeping an eye on the money for a bigger boss, while the fake boss sat in an office upstairs, entertained by girls and substances that were sent as gifts for the trouble of putting his name on the deed. In 1954, Tony Canero, or to his connections, the Admiral, put his flamboyant, gaudy boots on Mojave soil. He'd initially made his mark on the gambling scene by buying ships in his native California, hence his nickname. These ships, on the open water, were not under the microscope of the law, so he could set up betting tables, load them up with booze, women and boatloads of drugs that catered to celebrity clientele. His wildly successful floating casinos were eventually shut down, so he was forced to look elsewhere to set up shop. And what better place than Vegas? The Admiral wasn't exactly tied to any one faction or family. He was too flamboyant, liked to take too many risks, and he definitely had a flair for the dramatic. Despite his solo career, he was liked by many in the underworld, especially by Meyer Lansky, who saw potential in his wacky style of operations. In true Admiral fashion, he went a completely different route than the others had. He wasn't going to target the suit and tie crowd, he was going for the everyday man. The property he had bought on the Las Vegas Strip was only 36 acres, which was minuscule by the others' standards, though more than enough for Canero to give the working class a taste of affordable luxury. He called his little shindig the Stardust. There had always been dancing troupes in Vegas, but Canero took it to another level. Sequences, high heels, feathered boas and flashing lights that brought in massive crowds. He set out a golf course and hosted tournaments, added a racetrack for motorsports, and all of this was available for the common folk to view and to enter into the competitions themselves. He even set out space for an RV park where visitors could rent a place to sleep for next to nothing. This drastic shift that catered to regular folk was a raging success. Canero made more money in his first few months than any of the other high-end casinos had in their opening months. Best of all, he had no gambling at the Stardust at all. His criminal record didn't allow him to get a gambling license, so he made do with every other entertainment at his disposal instead. His business model helped shift Vegas from elite exclusivity to mass market tourism, a model that many would soon follow. Then, in 1955, just a year after buying the land and only a few months into opening its doors, the Admiral rolled his last dice. Quite literally. It was shortly after midnight and he just placed a bet down at Mo Dalitz's Desert Inn Casino on the Las Vegas Strip when he grabbed his chest and fell to the floor. He was pronounced dead of a heart attack at the hospital less than an hour later at the age of 55.
Whispers quickly spread that Canero hadn't died naturally at all, but someone had slipped poison into his drink. Suspicions were only deepened when his body was quietly removed from the casino floor before either the Clark County coroner or the sheriff's department were notified. The glass he was drinking from had been hastily washed, leaving deputies with nothing to examine. No autopsy was ever conducted, and when the case was later reviewed in Los Angeles, a coroner's jury simply ruled his death as a result of a heart attack. Canero barely spent a year in Sin City, yet his outrageous taste and his complete disregard for norms and expectations left a legacy more tangible than any of the other big players that helped shape Vegas. His vision of affordable luxury combined with his flair for spectacle made him a precursor to the corporate casino moguls who followed him.
In 1955 alone, Vegas doubled its population again, just barely falling short of 50,000 people. The Mafia were richer and more powerful than ever, and now they were almost completely invisible. Mo Dalitz was still around after Canero's death, or murder, depending on how you look at it. He hid behind grand gestures of charity and civic duty to keep the public on his side. He built hospitals and clinics for the papers to cover, while he was running an insurance scam behind those walls. Dalitz was a hero in the eyes of the papers, and at the top of every guest list at every charity event and party of note. He was called Mr. Las Vegas openly in the papers and behind closed doors. Dalitz was as instrumental to building Vegas from the ground up as Bugsy Siegel was. Meyer Lansky continued the role of financial strategist, orchestrating efficient laundering operations and setting up associates with silent partners and frontmen so that they could continue to anonymously open new business ventures. Joseph Doc Staker, another Lansky connection, organised huge events for the Rat Pack, Judy Garland, and acrobatic acts in the front, while he managed communications between the Italian Mafia and the Irish mob. This was the Vegas heyday era when the parties ran all night, the headliners were the greatest stars, and when the mob could do as they pleased. Beauties and stars like Eddie Fisher and Connie Stevens sipped ice drinks poolside, while Elvis Presley, Peter Lawford, Sophia Loren, and Andy Williams mingled among well-heeled vacationers. Movie premieres were no longer just a gathering. Vegas steamrolled the celebrity sit-downs so that common people could ask them questions. Sinatra's New Year bashes were so extravagant that people booked out hotels for the week to see all the attractions that came on his coattails. The 60s was Vegas in its most shining, entertaining, and most lucrative peak for the Mafia. Everywhere you looked was an associate rubbing shoulders with the elite, or keeping an eye on the cases of money being emptied from the tables. Then there's Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa and Frank Costello. Hoffa's embezzlement scheme in the Teamsters Union and various extortion and racketeering schemes made him one of the richest men within the mob. Costello, on the other hand, built his empire the old-fashioned way. His extensive bootlegging and gambling network during Prohibition, operating in New York, Florida, and Louisiana, alongside Lucky Luciano, made him infinitely more wealthy than Hoffa. However, it's Costello's political connections that made him especially formidable. Not that Hoffa didn't have a fair number of paid-for eyes and ears inside the government, mind you. It's just that Costello had a better network in place. He wasn't called the Prime Minister of the Mafia for nothing now, was he? Neither of them could openly own establishments in Vegas, but the law never stopped either of them, so why would they start marching to the federal drum now? Costello practically owned the Tropicana on the Las Vegas Strip, and he held stakes in more hotels and casinos than we'll ever know. He was a master when it came to keeping his name off the books. Hoffa was on another level though. He used his pension fund scam to bankroll the constructions of the Desert Inn, Caesar's Palace, Dunes, Stardust, Circus, and the Aladdin. Hoffa gave out loans to open these iconic landmarks with heavy interest rates, or the transfer was filed under a private loan while the receiver was just another frontman. Hoffa was practically Vegas royalty by the late 1950s and early 60s. Think of Hoffa as the invisible architect, the man whose signature could build a palace or bury a rival. He was as instrumental to shaping Vegas as Bugsy Siegel was.
Bugsy saw the dream and Jimmy Hoffa financed it. Hoffa's pension pot scam was a pot of gold that became the mob's new banking system. They couldn't take out loans from any actual bank, so they borrowed from Hoffa. He got to keep a sizable interest and replace what had been taken out of the fund with monthly installments from his lenders. Unfortunately, this wide blanket of banning any and all criminals from owning gambling licenses or opening any kind of gambling business forced people with no previous connections to the mob to take out these loans, therefore embroiling them into organised crime whether they intended to get involved or not. The feds, well, they'd unintentionally quadrupled their organised crime problem overnight, and if anyone was brave enough to miss a payment, then they were met with a sticky end somewhere else in the country. As long as these kinds of deadly disputes remained outside of the city limits, then no one was going to interfere. This was the rule since the 40s. No guns, no hits, and no blood spilt in Vegas. If you needed to take care of that kind of business, then you needed to do it on another state's soil, and every criminal, big or small, stayed true to that rule. Don't think though that there wasn't anyone dying in Vegas. There was plenty of loan sharks, drug addicts and petty criminals killing each other, and that helped keep the police busy. But there were surprisingly few mob-related killings during this silent partner boom.
Speaking of booms, the atomic bomb testing also had a minor part to play in the rise of Vegas. As you might know, the Nevada desert was the ideal place to test out these new super weapons, given that no one lived there. There were no above-ground water sources to contaminate, and the damage to the ecosystem would be minimal. Or maybe it was because the vast and harsh landscape made it nearly impossible for Russian spies to get close enough to report back to the Soviets. Not that they'd have been able to hide the mushroom clouds anyway, no matter how far out they went to deploy the bombs. People swarmed in from every part of the country to hold atomic watch parties on the highway leading into Vegas. And after the show, they'd go for a spot of gambling and to see some pretty dancing girls before heading back to wherever they'd come from. Vegas leaned in heavily on the attraction, selling trinkets and t-shirts. They held the Miss Atomic pageant, an event that ran for a few years. but it was the constructions around the bunkers, testing sites, and the new roads and airfields needed around them that really brought in the numbers. All workmen have some time off eventually, so where else were they going to go? To Las Vegas, of course. The government might not like to admit it, but their coins lined the mobsters' pockets too, and soon, that flow of cash would draw more eyes than ever before.
Opening of Wilbur Clark's Desert Inn.
But if you fall for crime,
I never got money from any of those.
organized gambling could be eliminated.
Mr. Frank Rosenthal!
Tremendous profits, illegal game.
Organized crime invested in Las Vegas.
Payback is the skim.
No dealers, Mr. Las Vegas.
Hard times make hard people.
By the end of the 50s, the feds had only managed to force every mob family to Vegas, and here they were so shielded by their frontmen and the hundreds of other shady characters that they were free to skim off every casino, medical centre, hotel and strip club as they pleased, continuously growing their ranks. And the authorities couldn't figure out how they were doing it because there was no paper trail to follow. Legally, at least, it was all legit. Then, Frank Costello made a big mistake. There was an assassination attempt on his life, and in the chaos of the scene, he forgot to empty his pockets. Police found a scrap of paper in his coat with the skimmings from the Tropicana Hotel. This was the physical evidence authorities needed to point them in the right direction. If New York's mobsters were skimming, then so were the families of Chicago, Los Angeles, and everywhere else. Armed with this little snippet of evidence, the new governor of Nevada created the Black Book, a list of names of bosses and associates within the mob that were deemed so dangerous that they weren't even allowed on casino floors. They could enter Nevada, but they couldn't visit the establishments that they secretly owned. A few mobsters fought hard against this little black book, and I hate to say it, but they kind of had a point. You didn't need to have a criminal record to be on it. Hearsay was enough to warrant a casino ban. That's a wide net to cast based only on words taken from the street. Tony the Ant Spilotro, a violent enforcer for the Chicago outfit, made it all the way to the Supreme Court with his complaints. He was heavily funded by the bosses and secret casino owners. The Ant was dangerous and very useful to them, but he was hardly a big player back then, so most likely he was their stooge to see how far they could take the matter. The Ant lost the case. The next one to fight the list was Frank Sinatra himself. You see, Sinatra owned a high-class lodge that also had a casino attached to it, called the Calneva Lodge and Casino, situated right on Lake Tahoe on the Nevada-California border. At this time, the lodge was home to Sam Giancana, who was supposed to appear in court for his various racketeering scams and political manipulation, including alleged CIA collaborations to assassinate Fidel Castro. Giancana was a big deal. He was the head of the Chicago outfit, and his staying at Sinatra's lodge ruffled a lot of feathers in the Senate. Everyone who had their sights on bringing the Mafia down had Giancana's name at the top of their lists.
Sinatra was already a bit of a pain in everyone's side by this point. He threw epic tantrums that left thousands of dollars worth of damage at a time. He got into fights, he was belligerent, and he was connected with every suspected mobman in Las Vegas. So losing his license because he'd wined and dined a known mob boss of this notoriety really shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone. But Sinatra was in many ways an overgrown child with a sense of self-importance and a habit of running his mouth. After shouting obscenities at every person of importance within the Nevada government, he lost his license anyway. He had to change the lodge's name to the Calneva Lodge, dropping the casino out of the name, all thanks to his hot temper. Even President Kennedy tried to speak on behalf of his good friend Sinatra, but the Black Book and Sinatra's name in it was backed by the Supreme Court. Even the President of the United States has limitations.
Don't feel too sorry for the mob though. They were making more money than ever. The book just made it uncomfortable to maneuver openly like they'd done before. If anything, the installment of the Black Book made them more dangerous than ever. It forced an already slippery enemy to become virtually invisible. Their need to stay off any books to keep their names out of transactions and to put frontmen in their place, all of this made them undetectable. In reality, the feds had nothing concrete on any of them. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, wasn't as lenient as his big brother about people skimming from union pensions and medical insurance whilst they beat their working girls into submission. Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General. He pushed to approve electronic surveillance on several casinos that they knew via the grapevine were run by frontmen for the guys that the feds had failed to catch for decades. Unfortunately, with only a scrap of paper from Costello's coat pocket to go on, it wasn't deemed lawful to surveil their suspects. Bobby told the FBI to do it anyway, and they got a whole lot of incriminating evidence alright, but it was useless since they couldn't use any of it in a court of law. One of their missions was to follow the money couriers and find out how they got the cash and how they delivered it. To their utter shock, most of the couriers were women, smartly dressed, middle-aged women. The deliveries were made through a tightly choreographed system where casino profits were skimmed before they were officially counted, then quietly funneled to mob bosses and investors. These ladies used trains for cross-country travel, a method that offered discretion and fewer eyes than airports. That's how Costello, Lansky, and all the rest got their earnings for the past few years.
The FBI couldn't do much with these video, photographic and taped pieces of evidence because getting their hands on this damning proof was technically illegal, but they could tip off the IRS. That's right, the feds were playing just as dirty as the hoodlums were. The IRS had the same problem that the feds did. They knew that the mob was skimming profits before it was being counted, but they couldn't prove it. They also knew that the doctored books and earnings equated to massive amounts in tax evasion, but again, there was no proof.
The feds knew that the IRS didn't have to abide by the same law that they did. The IRS could investigate without the same restrictions, they just needed a few breadcrumbs to get them started in the right direction. The feds then went on to accidentally misplace those files on a few journalists' desks to add to the publicity. And it would have worked if the bugs hadn't been discovered. The employees that the feds bullied into planting the recording devices showed their much scarier employers where the listening devices were, and the true owners of the casinos had their frontmen act in their stead by threatening to take the feds and the IRS to court. The mob had won. The amount in damages that the government would have had to pay out after such a lawsuit that they knew full well they were going to get burned for would be enough to build another Las Vegas all over again. But the mob wasn't unreasonable. They were willing to drop the lawsuits in exchange for the feds and the IRS to drop theirs.
Bobby Kennedy's ploy worked after all. The cat was out the bag, with or without any significant arrests. Vegas was now looking at around 150,000 residents and millions more in visitors in 1965, and all of that traffic was built on the mob. He'd proved that much. Las Vegas was going to continue ballooning. The money was always going to flow, but at least they could get it out of the hands of the mob. That was the only possible objective left on the table, illuminated by neon lights, billboards, and the glitter of dancing shoes. That was why they leaked the files. The plan was never to get anyone to court. They knew full well that Costello, Hoffa, and Lansky were far too powerful, too rich, and had too many lawmakers in their pockets to get even remotely close to them on anything. Bad press? Well, that was another matter entirely.
Hoffa and Mo Dalitz were totally reliant on their public image to keep their scams running. They were heroes in their communities. Dalitz was building Nevada's entire healthcare sector from the ground up, and Hoffa was the man of the people, the supporter of the unions, and the working class. Costello and Lansky weren't as publicly recognisable, but they were indispensable to this whole running line of outrageously well-coordinated skimming. Lansky was the finance guy to everyone of note, including a few governmental figures who wanted to hide their corruption, and many believe that Costello's unusually close relationship with the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, fueled by rumours of compromising photographs that Costello and Lansky allegedly used to blackmail him, with discreet meetings said to have taken place in Central Park, was the reason the mob were able to operate so freely in Las Vegas for so long. If these four fell, Costello, Lansky, Dalitz and Hoffa, maybe, just maybe, the whole network could be buried under the desert oasis that they'd built once and for all. Journalists Sandy Smith, Clark Mollenhoff and Jack Anderson all wrote scathing exposes on the mob. Sandy Smith focused on the skimming, whilst Jack Anderson outlined the union and pension fund fraud orchestrated by Hoffa. And the bad press worked. The Mafia were losing their public favour fast, and they retaliated in their tried and true fashion. After failing to sue the journalists, they had them all followed 24/7, hoping to scare them into silence. They called them at all hours of the night with threats and mailed them photos of their own families. There was even a serious attempt to poison Jack Anderson at one point, but it was all too late. The news was out on the cover of every paper, and by the end of the 60s, the Mafia were once again public enemy number one. With their power slipping, their frontmen that technically were the legal owners of the casinos and the lounges were getting nervous about their affiliations. The loyalty that kept the mob running for all these decades can only remain intact if they are at the top of the food chain. That saying that I mentioned earlier, starving dogs turned on each other, and that was about to happen again. And here's where another unexpected figure stepped into the fold and completely ripped the carpet out from under them. Only Howard Hughes wasn't Mafia, he wasn't a freelance criminal, and he had no rap sheet at all. He was just a very old billionaire that Dalitz happened to annoy. Howard Hughes made his money in oil back in the day, and he'd virtually retired from the public eye. He had his people run his everyday affairs while he hid behind the walls of his various estates for months at a time. He even bandaged his face up during travels from one mansion to the other so that people couldn't photograph him. In 1966, he booked out the entire floor of the Desert Inn, owned by Mo Dalitz. Hughes wasn't a gambler or a drinker, nor did he entertain exotic dancers. He was a staunch Mormon. Unfortunately, religious men aren't good for business in Vegas. The suites at the Desert Inn weren't as expensive as you'd think such an exclusive place would be. The reason for this was because rich clientele spent obscene amounts of money at the tables, so this was a perk that was given to big spenders. When a famous billionaire was offered the same leniency, Dalitz quickly came to regret his generosity. Hughes wasn't just visiting for a few days, he hunkered down on the first floor for 6 whole months. Dalitz tried talking to Hughes' team to find other accommodations for the oil tycoon, and Hughes was deeply offended that his money and his presence wasn't good enough. So he took revenge in the most delicious way possible. He bought almost all of the largest casinos and hotels in Vegas overnight. The Silver Slipper, Castaways, the Frontier Hotel, the Sands, and the Landmark Hotel, to name a few. He even tried to buy the Stardust, but was blocked on antitrust grounds due to his growing monopoly.
Surprisingly, the mob allowed this to happen. Their control over their frontmen was slipping, the IRS and the FBI were slowly getting closer and closer to making arrests, and the public were no longer on their side. The New York, Los Angeles and New Jersey factions decided that it was safer to cash out when Hughes made them offers that were well above the establishment's value, and that meant that Costello was out.
The Chicago outfit that Hoffa was tied to decided to do the same. Shortly afterward, Dalitz and Lansky's allies followed suit. Whether or not these four wanted to sell out didn't matter. When the commission decides that it's a financially smart move to sell, then the family has spoken, and that's the end of the discussion. Hoffa and Dalitz were especially salty about this, but they went ahead anyway and took their dealings elsewhere. Lansky did what he always did, silently slipped away and set up shop at another location without much fanfare, and that shattered the mob's hold on Vegas. In just 3 years, Howard Hughes did what the IRS, the FBI, and the Supreme Court had failed to do for the better part of a century. He didn't just take out the big players, he invited the other side in. He put ex-FBI agents at the head of all security details, funded the first video surveillance systems in his casinos, and made it available for everybody else. He put more money into security than any upgrades or maintenance, and within 5 years of him buying in, the entire way that Vegas was run had completely changed for the first time in its history. There was still plenty of managers, floor operators and dealers in the casinos that were running scams for their bosses up north, but they were having trouble sidestepping the ridiculous amount of security and sudden influx of investigative financial personnel around. Their presence became less and less. Dalitz and Costello managed to hold on to the Aladdin, the Desert Inn, and the Tropicana from afar, and Circus, June's, the Flamingo and the Riviera remained under mob ownership for a few more decades. It might sound like a lot, but this was a fraction of what the mob owned just 5 years before. They took their business even deeper underground, so much that Las Vegas had once been their main source of income had become a side hustle in just a few years. Atlantic City, Florida and Midwestern casinos became their new focus to make up for the loss. But this final stretch between 1965 and 1970 was the breaking point all around. After the mob lost Las Vegas, everything else started to unravel fast for them. The Chicago outfit sent in Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal to try and salvage what little foothold they had left, and he actually managed to keep things afloat for a few years while the mob found new streams of income to make up for their losses as Hughes bought their enterprises out from under them. Lefty didn't go for old muscle techniques, much like Lansky. Lefty was a man who used his brains. Lefty initially made his money by using a home improvement front to run the largest illegal parlay card book in the country. He was in a lot of hot water with the authorities thanks to his habit of blowing up rivals' cars and office buildings in Miami. So when the Mafia offered to set him up in Vegas, he was more than happy to skip town. There, he put aside the explosives and instead reshaped casino management. Besides, violence wasn't necessary anymore. There were barely any highballers left that could offer any resistance to his takeover. He took up the only viable betting option left in Vegas that wasn't out of the Mafia's hands: sports betting. He was the one to bring sports wagering into the casino mainstream in the early 1970s, turning the sports book from a backroom afterthought into a major profit center and marketing tool. He also embraced Hughes's electronic surveillance systems and oversaw the mob's first CCTV camera installations, making enormous strides to keep the in-house skimming to the bare minimum. Under Lefty's electronic eye, the mob barely lost a cent to dealers, transport mules, or counters anymore. There's another thing that Lefty did that changed the game. He hired analysts to track better behavior, game drops, and win or loss metrics night by night. This system is what keeps Vegas running even now and how they catch card counting operations. Lefty was a genius, both as an analytics expert and in entertainment, proving that brain over brawn always wins out at the end of the day. But there was a darker complication. Lefty's childhood friend and fellow Chicago outfit member, Anthony the Ant Spilotro. The two had grown up together in Chicago and were sent west at the same time, though with very different jobs. Lefty was there to keep the books clean, the Ant was there to make sure the outfit's will was enforced, and their overlap in Las Vegas would prove disastrous. They were tasked with running a skimming operation focused on the 4 major casinos: the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. If you recall, the Ant was the stooge that the Chicago faction had sent over to tackle the issue of the law change that gambling licenses could be denied based on criminal history. He lost the case against the Supreme Court, and it was always assumed that the Chicago faction had sent a lower-level enforcer just to see how far they could take the matter without putting anyone or anything of value on the line. But that was 20 years ago, and in that time, the Ant had grown to become a very formidable figure in Chicago. Standing at only 5'2", the Ant was appropriately named, but for all his small stature, he was the walking embodiment of a man with a Napoleon complex. The Ant was a monster. He was responsible for nearly 24 murders in Illinois and Nevada during the 60s, making him one of the outfit's most feared hitmen. His signature brutality is exemplified by the 1963 M&M murders, where 2 thieves were tortured, resulting in one thief's head being crushed in a vice until his eyes popped out of his skull, and that's just the more tame of his torture experiments. The Ant wasn't simply dangerous, he was downright psychotic. When he touched down in Vegas, he took out anyone who dared pose resistance, and he's the reason we're still finding bodies in barrels washing up out of waterways around Sin City now. You probably noticed that the Ant's behaviour was a far cry from the long-standing agreement that no hits were to take place in Vegas, and no one in the mob was happy about the Ant's disregard for the rules. He had a price on his head for his brutal disregard for the rules. He'd originally been sent back to Vegas by Sam Giancana, who was then the boss of the Chicago faction, but he later fell under the new boss, Tony Accardo, when Giancana got assassinated in his own basement.
The head of the FBI's organized crime squad in Chicago says Giancana was killed because he had fallen from favor with his one-time associates.
Initially, the Ant did a surprisingly good job of skimming from the top, which was no easy feat given the increased security that they had to navigate. He had a significant team of roughhouses that threatened, beat, and bullied a handful of employees into the scam. Beatings and bullyings wasn't enough to satiate his hunger for violence though. Bored with casino oversight, the Ant formed the Hole in the Wall Gang, a burglary crew notorious for drilling through ceilings and walls to rob jewelry stores, warehouses, and even casino vaults. They stole construction machinery, raided warehouses for tools, and even drove cars straight through storefronts in smash and grabs. For a few years, their robberies plus their skimming operations on the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and Marina casinos made the outfit millions, but their recklessness also drew enormous heat.
On July the 4th, 1981, the gang tried to rob Bertha's Gifts and Home Furnishings, East Sahara Avenue. The burglary was a disaster. Several members were arrested on the spot, including Frank Carlotta, one of Spilotro's closest men. When the FBI later played Carlotta a tape of Spilotro talking about cleaning dirty laundry, which Carlotta took as code for killing him, he flipped.
I was angry. I felt as though I was betrayed. So I called the FBI. Then we sat down and I gave him all this information that I had.
In court, he confessed to over 300 crimes and tied Spilotro directly to murders dating back to the early 60s. Meanwhile, Lefty's personal life unravelled. He had married Jerry McGee in 1969, and together they had 2 children. But Jerry struggled with alcohol and drugs, and their marriage was plagued by infidelity on both sides. Her affair with Spilotro was an open secret corporate in Vegas and drove a permanent wedge between the two childhood friends. In 1981, she divorced Lefty, stealing part of his savings, and the following year she was found dead in a Los Angeles motel from a lethal cocktail of cocaine, Valium, and alcohol. She was just 46 years old. Lefty himself became a target. In 1976, the Nevada Gaming Control Board, chaired by Harry Reid, the future Senate Majority Leader, ruled that Rosenthal could not hold a gaming license because of his mob ties and criminal record.
I call him a hypocrite and the fellow members of this commission to deny me a fair hearing.
Still, he continued running the 4 major casinos from behind the scenes. But by October the 4th, 1982, his enemies finally struck. As Rosenthal started his 1981 Cadillac Eldorado in the parking lot of Tony Roma's restaurant at 620 East Sahara Avenue, a bomb attached to the gasoline tank detonated. The blast tore through the car, but by a quirk of engineering or a miracle, he survived. General Motors had installed a metal plate beneath the driver's seat of that model to correct a balancing problem, and it absorbed much of the explosion. Lefty staggered from the wreckage, dazed but alive, shouting, "They're trying to kill me." Though no one was ever charged, FBI wiretaps later suggested Milwaukee boss Frank Balistrieri, known as the Mad Bomber, may have been responsible. Lefty left Las Vegas immediately. By the mid-1980s, Spilottro's unchecked violence had made him a liability. Even the outfit had had enough. In June 1986, he and his brother Michael disappeared after leaving Michael's home in Oak Park, Illinois. A week later, their bodies were found buried in an Indiana cornfield, beaten to death and stripped to their underwear. The outfit's brutal punishment for breaking the rules. With Spilottro gone and Lefty forced out, the mob's last true grip on Las Vegas collapsed. The hole in the wall gang dissolved, skimming dried up under tighter surveillance, and the Strip increasingly fell into the hands of legitimate corporations and businessmen. By 1980, Hughes's blueprint for corporate control had replaced the mob's empire, closing the book on the bloodiest era in Vegas's history. But for Las Vegas itself, oh, it's bigger and brighter than ever. It has 500,000 permanent residents and 40 million visitors every year, and just about every inch of the city holds some kind of entertainment or another. If ever all humans were to disappear from the earth overnight, the solar-powered lights of Vegas would be the last lights visible in the night sky for another century, while the rest of the world had long since crumbled around it. The amount of neon will quite literally outlive skyscrapers in the event of an apocalypse. So, even if the Mafia's power was truly broken, their legacy will never die as long as Vegas lives.
Thanks so much for watching. Please do like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video, and you can also join the discussion in my Discord, which is now free for everyone. It's an app where we discuss these characters and the stories in much more detail and just about everything else, to be honest. I'll leave the invite link in a pinned comment on this video if you want to join. If not, that's absolutely fine, and I'll see you in the next one.